The chamber was still, the kind of stillness that always arrives just before something breaks. Cameras whirred, pens tapped against notepads, and every eye in the hearing was locked on the Wisconsin senator who leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Ron Johnson adjusted his microphone, squinting at the young congresswoman across from him, as though she were an unwelcome guest who'd wandered into his domain. Then came the jab, not at policy, not at evidence, but at her very existence. With a casual shrug, Johnson mocked Jasmine Crockett's background, suggesting that someone with her kind of upbringing couldn't possibly understand the complexities of governance. His words dripped with condescension, each syllable sharpened like a blade meant to slice away at her dignity. The insult hung in the air. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Some staffers shifted in their seats, others dropped their gaze to the floor, unwilling to meet Crockett's eyes. It wasn't just an attack, it was a dismissal, an attempt to reduce her story to a punchline. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she straightened in her chair, her calm composure forming a quiet counterweight to Johnson's arrogance. The contrast was cinematic, one man snickering at his own cruelty, one woman steady as stone, preparing her reply. The audience sensed it. The silence thickened, as though the very walls of the chamber leaned in to hear what would come next. Johnson, mistaking her stillness for submission, leaned forward with a grin, ready to double down. He didn't know it yet, but he had just set the stage for his own undoing. Her lips parted, and in that instant the balance of power shifted. This wasn't going to be another routine insult shrugged off. What she was about to deliver would reverberate far beyond the marble pillars of the hearing room. Because in a country where millions knew what it felt like to have their roots mocked, their identities belittled, their worth questioned, Crockett was about to become their voice. And when her words finally landed, the chamber froze in shock. But no one expected what came next, not even Johnson himself. What happened in that hearing room wasn't just another petty clash between lawmakers. It wasn't another forgettable soundbite lost in the churn of Washington headlines. No, this was something far larger, far heavier, because it tapped into a wound that millions of Americans know too well. When Ron Johnson mocked Jasmine Crockett's background, he wasn't only mocking her. He was mocking everyone who has ever been told they weren't polished enough, wealthy enough, connected enough to belong. For years, Johnson had built a reputation on that kind of sneering dismissal. To his supporters, it was straight talk. To his critics, it was cruelty packaged as candor. He relished belittling those who came from working-class neighborhoods, immigrant households, or communities scarred by systemic neglect. His words carried the weight of entitlement, the smug certainty that power was his by birthright, not something to be earned or questioned. And there, across from him, sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman who embodied the very America Johnson seemed intent on erasing. She wasn't born into wealth. She didn't climb her way to influence through family connections. She fought for it. She studied, struggled, sacrificed, and arrived in Washington as a voice for those who rarely get heard in its marble halls. To Johnson, her presence was an inconvenience. To millions watching, it was hope incarnate. That is why the stakes of this clash ran so high. This wasn't just about Ron Johnson versus Jasmine Crockett. It was about arrogance versus dignity, derision versus pride. When he tried to belittle her, he inadvertently spotlighted everything people despise about Washington elitism, the disdain for ordinary lives, the dismissal of resilience. And when she prepared to answer him, the room held its breath because everyone could sense it. History was about to tilt, even if just by a fraction. The moment mattered because people recognized themselves in her silence, in the way she absorbed the insult without flinching, in the way she steadied herself before speaking. Millions of Americans know that silence. They know what it feels like to hear someone laugh at their roots, their accent, their neighborhood. They know what it feels like to be told they don't belong. And in Jasmine Crockett, they saw a chance to answer back. Social media was already primed for explosion. Clips from the hearing were being cut, captions added, outrage bubbling in real time. Twitter threads filled with phrases like, "Did he really just say that?" TikTok creators stitched the footage with their own commentary, voices trembling with fury. People didn't just watch, they felt implicated, as though Johnson's words had been aimed at them personally. That was the genius of the moment. It transcended two names on a roster and became a mirror for the entire country. What happens when the powerful mock the powerless? What happens when entitlement tries to laugh dignity out of the room? Americans were about to see, and they would not forget it. Because this wasn't only about policy, votes, or speeches. It was about identity itself, who gets to speak, who gets dismissed, and who refuses to stay silent. And when Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, she carried not just her own story but the stories of countless others who had been mocked, doubted, and underestimated. And to understand why this moment hit so hard, we have to see the man behind the arrogance. Ron Johnson did not stumble into politics as a man of the people. He entered it cloaked in the armor of privilege, armed with the kind of certainty that comes from never truly knowing what it means to struggle. A businessman first, a senator later, he cultivated the image of a plain-spoken outsider. Yet beneath the surface, his career reflected a pattern: the constant belittling of anyone who dared to challenge him, especially those whose backgrounds did not mirror his own. Time and again, Johnson positioned himself not as a servant of the people but as a gatekeeper of power. He spoke of real America as though it belonged only to those who shared his wealth, his worldview, his narrow idea of legitimacy. To him, disagreement wasn't a debate, it was an opportunity to diminish. He laughed off critics as naive, painted colleagues as unworthy, and carried himself with the air of a man convinced that power was an entitlement rather than a responsibility. His hearings and interviews were littered with the same dismissive tones that echoed in that chamber the day he mocked Jasmine Crockett. He interrupted experts, waved off journalists, and scoffed at testimony that challenged his positions. If someone came armed with facts, Johnson countered with smirks. If they came with lived experience, he met them with derision. The message was always the same: "I know better, you don't belong here." This pattern earned him both admiration and resentment. To those who prized defiance over dignity, Johnson was a hero. To those who saw leadership as service, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how arrogance corrodes the public trust. But no matter which side you stood on, one thing was undeniable: Johnson thrived on belittlement. His entire persona was built on the art of underestimation. And yet therein lay his fatal flaw. Because when you underestimate others, you blind yourself to their strength. Johnson failed to grasp that the America outside his office windows was changing. The halls of power were no longer reserved for the privileged few who looked and spoke like him. The faces in Congress were younger, more diverse, more rooted in communities that had fought for a seat at the table, and none embodied that shift more vividly than Jasmine Crockett. But Johnson didn't see that, or perhaps he refused to. To him, Crockett was simply another opponent to swat away with sarcasm, another voice to drown in laughter. He mistook her silence for weakness, her composure for timidity. He forgot that the very things he mocked, her background, her struggles, her identity, were the source of her power. That's what makes him such a classic antagonist in this story. Not merely because he insulted her, but because he represented something larger: the archetype of entitlement that has long shadowed American politics. He was the figure who sees public office as a stage for self-importance, who treats colleagues not as equals but as obstacles, who mistakes cruelty for strength. And like all antagonists, he was blind to the turning tide. The chamber he sneered in was not filled with silent witnesses. It was lined with cameras transmitting every expression, every word, to millions watching beyond those walls. What once might have been dismissed as just another moment in Washington was now immortalized in viral clips, dissected and replayed until his smirk became a symbol of everything people loathed about elitist arrogance. Johnson's story is not unique. It echoes the careers of others who have mistaken privilege for superiority, who have worn power like a crown instead of a duty. But what made this particular clash so explosive was the collision of that arrogance with someone who was not only prepared to answer it, but destined to. Because across from Ron Johnson sat a woman whose life had been the opposite of his. A woman who had clawed her way into the very halls he took for granted. A woman who embodied the resilience he dismissed, the grit he ignored, and the dignity he tried to mock. Johnson believed he was facing another opponent he could laugh off. In reality, he was staring down the kind of story America has always celebrated: the underdog rising, the silent speaking, the underestimated proving the world wrong. And that miscalculation, that blindness to the power of her journey, would lead to his unraveling. But across from him sat someone very different, someone whose journey made her the last person he should have underestimated. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin under the bright lights of Washington, nor did it unfold within the insulated world of inherited privilege. It began in the quiet grit of neighborhoods where survival itself demanded resilience, where dreams often met barriers, and where ambition was measured not in entitlement but in endurance. She grew up in a world where nothing was promised and everything was fought for, a stark contrast to the man who would one day try to belittle her for it. From an early age, Crockett understood that dignity wasn't something handed down. It was something built brick by brick, through struggle and perseverance. She knew the sting of being underestimated, the weight of being doubted, the exhaustion of having to prove, again and again, that she belonged in rooms not designed for her. As a young black woman navigating systems historically stacked against her, every step forward came with the echo of voices telling her she couldn't. But instead of shrinking under that pressure, she forged strength from it. Education became her weapon. She studied relentlessly, carving out her place in spaces where few who looked like her had been welcomed. Law became her calling, not because it was lucrative, but because it was a shield and a sword. She chose to defend the voiceless, to stand for those who couldn't stand alone. Her courtroom presence grew into legend among those who watched her dismantle flawed arguments with precision and clarity. Crockett's reputation was not built on theatrics or empty rhetoric. It was built on truth. She cut through noise the way light slices through fog, her words steady, her tone unshaken. For communities long ignored, she became an advocate. For opponents who relied on bluster, she became a nightmare. Because unlike them, she had no illusions about how fragile justice could be. She had lived its absence. Every case she took, every fight she embraced, carried echoes of her own journey. She knew what it was to feel voiceless. She knew the subtle cruelty of being told you weren't good enough because of where you came from or what you looked like. And she knew that every victory in the courtroom, no matter how small, was another crack in the walls that had held so many back for so long. So when Jasmine Crockett stepped into Congress, she did so with the gravity of 1,000 untold stories behind her. She wasn't there as an ornament, nor as a token. She was there as a fighter forged in the fires of struggle, carrying the weight of communities who needed more than promises. They needed proof that someone like them could not only survive in power but thrive in it. It was this background, the very thing Ron Johnson chose to mock, that made her powerful. Because where he saw weakness, the country saw strength. Where he heard an easy target, people heard resilience. Her journey was a direct contradiction to everything he embodied: entitlement versus effort, arrogance versus humility, mockery versus meaning. To the millions who watched her rise, she wasn't just another politician. She was proof. Proof that you could come from modest beginnings and still ascend to the highest stages. Proof that identity wasn't a burden but a badge of honor. Proof that in a country often defined by division, there remained voices who could turn scars into sources of strength. And this is why the confrontation between them carried such gravity. When Johnson attempted to dismiss her with a smirk, he wasn't just underestimating a colleague. He was underestimating the sum of her life's battles. He was underestimating a woman who had been told no more times than he had ever been told yes. He was underestimating someone who had already survived storms he could never imagine. What Johnson failed to recognize and what America was about to witness was that Crockett's composure in that moment was not silence born of intimidation. It was silence born of preparation. She had faced worse. She had endured harsher words, crueler doubts, deeper obstacles, and every single time she had emerged stronger. Her calm gaze across the chamber that day wasn't submission, it was calculation. It was the look of someone who understood that her story had brought her to this precise moment for a reason. It was the look of a fighter who knew when to strike. Because Jasmine Crockett's background wasn't something to laugh at. It was something to fear if you stood on the wrong side of justice. And that's why, when Johnson made his move, she was more than ready to make hers. The air in the chamber thickened as the hearing pressed on, though no one seemed to be listening to the agenda anymore. Eyes darted not toward documents or testimony, but between the two figures locked in a quiet duel across the polished table. Ron Johnson leaned forward, voice sharp, his words designed not to probe but to provoke. He interrupted mid-sentence, his tone clipped and mocking, weaving little jabs into the official dialogue as if daring Jasmine Crockett to lose her composure. He laughed under his breath when she spoke with clarity, rolling his eyes just enough for the cameras to catch. He muttered snide comments, barely audible but perfectly timed to slice through her statements. Every move was calculated to diminish her presence, to transform her into a caricature instead of a congresswoman. His sneer carried the unspoken message: "You don't belong here, and I'll remind you until you break." But Crockett did not break. She kept her voice steady, her posture composed. Her responses were measured, deliberate, her cadence signaling control rather than submission. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her eyes told a different story. They glinted with the restrained energy of a storm waiting to be unleashed. Every insult, every interruption, every mocking laugh was fuel collecting in silence, waiting for the moment to ignite. The audience in the chamber sensed it too. Reporters stopped scribbling notes, their pens hovering midair. Staffers glanced nervously between the two, torn between unease and anticipation. The tension was no longer hidden. It was alive, a pulse running through the room. Even the cameras seemed to zoom closer, as though the lens itself understood something monumental was building. Johnson pressed harder, mistaking her silence for weakness. He raised his voice, his words dripping with arrogance, questioning her qualifications, her credibility, even the merit of her very presence at the table. Each interruption was more brazen than the last, his smirk widening as if he believed the room belonged to him alone. But Crockett's silence was not surrender, it was strategy. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands together, allowing him the illusion of dominance. Her restraint was a canvas, and Johnson was painting himself into a corner with every arrogant stroke. The more he talked, the clearer it became. His cruelty was not strength but insecurity laid bare for all to see. Those watching from beyond the chamber on television screens, live streams, and social media feeds felt the tension coil tighter with each second. Viewers typed furiously in comment threads, calling out his arrogance, their outrage rising in real time. But underneath the fury, they were waiting for something else. They were waiting for her. Because anyone who had followed Jasmine Crockett's journey knew she was not the kind of woman to sit quietly forever. Her composure was not the calm of defeat. It was the calm of precision. She was letting Johnson dig his own hole, letting his interruptions pile up like stones stacked high, until one sharp push would send it all collapsing down. And in that chamber, at that moment, she gave the faintest of smiles, not wide, not overt, but enough for those paying attention to realize the storm was about to break. Johnson did not notice. He was too busy reveling in his own words, too caught up in the performance of belittlement to see that the room had already turned against him. Every laugh, every sneer, every dismissive wave of his hand wasn't landing as dominance anymore. It was landing as desperation. The stage was set, the tension unbearable, the silence electric. And then, with the entire chamber holding its breath, she struck back. The storm broke not with shouting but with silence. Jasmine Crockett let Johnson finish his latest interruption, his smirk curling as if he had scored yet another petty victory. The room seemed to tilt in his direction until she leaned forward slowly, deliberately, her hands unclasping on the table. That tiny gesture alone shifted the energy. The chamber grew still. Even Johnson, mid-laugh, faltered for half a breath, sensing something was different. Her voice came low at first, steady, unshaken. "Senator Johnson," she said, her tone laced with clarity that cut sharper than any shout could. "I've listened to you mock my background, my roots, my journey into this chamber. And I want to make one thing clear. The very background you belittle is the reason I sit here today." Gasps rippled across the room. Pens hit paper, cameras zoomed closer. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air, forcing everyone, especially Johnson, to sit with them. Then, with her calm gaze locked on him, she continued. "You see, Senator, I wasn't born into boardrooms or handed a stage on which to perform. I was raised in communities where children learned to be tough because life gave them no other choice, where mothers worked double shifts to keep the lights on, where justice wasn't an abstract word, but the difference between whether someone ate that night or didn't." Her tone sharpened, the cadence deliberate. "And it was that reality that made me fight my way into law. It was that reality that made me defend those who couldn't defend themselves. And it was that reality that brought me here to stand as a voice for people you seem to think don't count." The chamber buzzed with murmurs, reporters glancing at one another with raised eyebrows. A senator from the back shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. Johnson's smirk had begun to falter. He leaned forward, trying to interject, but this time, Crockett's voice surged over him with the authority of someone who had had enough. "Let me explain something, Senator," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You mock where I come from, but where I come from is exactly why I will never underestimate the power of perseverance. I didn't inherit a seat at this table. I earned it. Every late night, every courtroom battle, every time I was told I wasn't good enough and proved them wrong. That is what built me. That is what brought me here." Applause began to stir, not from staffers, who were bound by decorum, but from the subtle sound of hands clapping in the overflow rooms where the public watched. Someone coughed to cover a laugh. Someone else muttered "damn" under their breath. Crockett leaned in closer, her voice now unmistakably commanding. "So when you sit here and try to reduce me to a punchline, remember this. You are not mocking me alone. You are mocking the single mother working 2 jobs. You are mocking the young man who studies by candlelight because the power bill couldn't be paid. You are mocking the immigrant who risked everything to give their children a better life. That's who you dismiss when you dismiss me." The room fell utterly silent. For the first time that day, Johnson had no interruption at the ready. His smirk cracked, his lips tightening as he shifted in his seat. The confidence he had worn like armor just moments before now looked flimsy, like a costume beginning to fray. Crockett allowed the silence to stretch, her gaze unwavering. Then, with surgical precision, she delivered the line that would echo far beyond the chamber. "And Senator Johnson," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "if my background disqualifies me in your eyes, then it's not my seat in this chamber that's in question. It's yours." The explosion was instantaneous. Gasps, whispers, muffled laughter, the frantic clicking of cameras. Reporters scrambled to get the quote down word for word. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh, he's not coming back from that." Johnson's face turned red. He shifted again, fumbling with his notes, trying to regain footing. But the damage was done, and everyone in the room knew it. The man who had built a career on mockery had just been dismantled by the very thing he despised, a woman who refused to be reduced. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice in triumph. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands once more, her expression calm, almost serene, the picture of composure. It wasn't victory through aggression. It was victory through undeniable truth. And that made it sting even more. Johnson attempted one last retort, but it landed flat, his words drowned out by the buzz of the room. His smirk was gone, replaced by a thin line of frustration. He gathered his papers with an awkward shuffle, his chair scraping against the floor as he rose. Gasps again. Was he really leaving? The disbelief spread like wildfire. Senators didn't just walk out in the middle of a hearing, not unless they had no other move left. But that's exactly what he did. Ron Johnson pushed himself away from the table, muttered something inaudible under his breath, and stormed toward the door. The cameras followed every step, every twitch of his jaw, every flicker of humiliation etched across his face. The door slammed shut behind him with a reverberating thud that seemed to signal more than an exit. It signaled a collapse. The chamber erupted. Reporters rushed into the hall, staffers whispered furiously, and the audience outside began sending the clip into cyberspace faster than it could even be captioned. Johnson had walked out, defeated not by shouting or insults, but by the quiet power of truth spoken with precision. And Jasmine Crockett, she remained seated, her calm presence glowing brighter in the aftermath of his departure. She had not only defended her dignity, she had defended the dignity of everyone who had ever been mocked for their roots. The cameras stayed fixed on her, capturing the image that would soon dominate headlines, hashtags, and history books. A woman unshaken, a hero forged from struggle, sitting tall while arrogance fled the room. But what happened after he stormed out might be even more shocking. The sound of that door slamming behind Ron Johnson hadn't even finished echoing before the clip was already spreading across screens. Phones shot up in the overflow room, staffers texted reporters, and within minutes hashtags began to bloom like wildfire. By the time Crockett walked out of the chamber herself, 3 words were already climbing the charts on Twitter: Crockett Clapback. The video looped endlessly. Johnson's sneer, Crockett's calm stare, the devastating line, "It's not my seat in this chamber that's in question, it's yours." The delivery became an instant cultural touchstone. A tweet with over 500,000 likes read, "Jasmine Crockett just turned Ron Johnson into a footnote in real time. Legendary." Another viral post paired the clip with the caption, "When you try to come for her but she's got facts, fire and grace on deck." On TikTok, creators stitched the moment with everything from gospel choirs swelling at the exact instant she landed the blow, to dancers reenacting Johnson's dramatic exit with exaggerated stomps. One clip racked up millions of views overnight, captioned, "How it feels to lose an argument with Jasmine Crockett." Cue the sound of a door slamming, perfectly synced. Cable news wasted no time. MSNBC ran the segment on loop with Chiron headlines like, "Crockett dismantles Johnson in stunning exchange." CNN hosted a panel where commentators nodded in collective awe, one analyst declaring, "This wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a cultural reset in real time." Even conservative outlets, while scrambling to spin the narrative, couldn't ignore the footage dominating every feed. One Fox commentator muttered, "Well, that didn't go the way Johnson planned." Memes exploded. A side-by-side image circulated. On the left, Johnson walking out. On the right, Crockett sitting poised with the caption, "Know the difference between power and strength." Another meme showed Johnson's face morphing into a disappearing Thanos dust cloud with the words, "Crockett snapped." But the reaction wasn't just entertainment. It was vindication. For millions who had grown weary of watching arrogance go unchecked, this moment was a release valve, the kind of public reckoning they rarely got to see. Community leaders tweeted out support, teachers shared the clip in classrooms, and young activists claimed it as proof that representation mattered. "That's what happens," one organizer posted, "when you put a fighter in the room who remembers where she came from." By nightfall, Crockett's name was trending globally. Her follower count skyrocketed, donations to her campaign surged and her inbox overflowed with messages from ordinary Americans saying thank you. A nurse in Detroit wrote, "You said what so many of us have wanted to say for years." A student in California posted, "I didn't think politics could feel like this. I feel seen." And for Johnson, the mockery was merciless. Clips of his red face and hasty exit were remixed into comedy sketches, soundtracked with everything from Benny Hill music to sad violins. Headlines the next morning didn't mince words. Johnson walks out, Crockett stands tall. The moment had broken out of the insular world of hearings and politics. It was now a cultural phenomenon, a piece of collective memory replayed at kitchen tables, office break rooms, and subway commutes. People weren't just watching, they were reliving it, sharing it, celebrating it as though they had been in that chamber themselves. And that was the real power of the moment. It didn't just belong to Crockett. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked for where they came from. Yet beyond the headlines and viral clips, there was something even deeper at stake. When the dust settled and the memes slowed, what lingered wasn't just the thrill of a clapback or the comedy of a walkout. What lingered was something deeper, the sense that dignity had not only survived an assault, it had prevailed. Jasmine Crockett's reply was more than a sharp retort. It was a reminder that truth, spoken plainly and without fear, can cut through arrogance like sunlight through fog. Ron Johnson tried to make a background into a weakness. He tried to turn a personal story into an insult. But Crockett flipped the script. She showed that what some call disadvantage is, in reality, resilience forged in fire. That every obstacle becomes a credential when you survive it and keep walking forward. This wasn't just a political skirmish. It was a symbolic battle between two visions of America. One vision that sneers at difference, that sees power as a license to belittle. And another vision, Crockett's vision, that insists dignity is not negotiable, that strength can be quiet, composed, and unshakably proud of its roots. Viewers who replayed that clip weren't just celebrating a political win. They were celebrating a kind of justice they don't often get to see, the arrogant being humbled, the underestimated rising. It felt like a collective exhale for anyone who has ever been told they don't belong. And beyond the theatrics, the lesson is timeless. Power built on mockery crumbles the moment it's challenged by integrity. Johnson's walkout was proof of that, not a demonstration of strength, but of fragility. Crockett, on the other hand, walked away with more than applause. She walked away as a living reminder that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands calm, delivers the truth, and lets the silence after do the heavy lifting. Her words now belong to more than just her. They've been claimed by students who refuse to shrink, by workers who demand respect, by immigrants who know that their stories are woven into the American fabric, no matter who tries to cut them out. Crockett gave voice to that collective conviction. That's why the clip resonated beyond headlines and hashtags, because people didn't just hear her, they felt themselves in her. They saw their mothers, their grandparents, their own journeys reflected back in her defiance. It was personal. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson of all, that politics at its best doesn't just happen in marble rooms with microphones. It happens in the hearts of those watching, who take inspiration and carry it into their own battles. Jasmine Crockett turned an insult into a torch, and now countless others are carrying that flame forward. And that's why this story isn't just about one exchange, it's about all of us. Ron Johnson walked into that hearing convinced he held the upper hand. He mocked, he sneered, he tried to reduce Jasmine Crockett to a caricature of her background. But by the time he stormed out, the story had flipped completely. The powerful looked small. The underestimated stood tall. And the moment etched itself into the national memory, not as Johnson intended, but as Crockett defined it. That is the essence of this story. A senator tried to weaponize arrogance and instead exposed his own fragility. A congresswoman rooted in resilience turned his dismissal into her triumph. and millions of people watching from their homes saw more than just political theater. They saw proof that dignity can win, even in the most hostile rooms. But here's the truth. This can't just be a one-time moment. If you felt that surge of pride when Crockett spoke, if you replayed the clip because it gave you hope, then you're part of something larger. You're part of a community that refuses to bow to mockery, that insists voices like hers deserve not just to be heard, but to be amplified. So share this story, pass it on to friends, to family, to anyone who needs the reminder that arrogance doesn't get the final word. Subscribe if you believe dignity and justice should always have a platform. And most importantly, carry this energy into your own conversations, because that's how movements grow, one voice at a time. Ron Johnson may have walked out of that chamber, but Jasmine Crockett walked out with something much greater, the respect of a nation. And together, we can make sure that respect echoes far beyond one viral moment.